Hi, and welcome to another video in this project here with our SQL database application. In this index, we're showing all of the things that we're doing in this course. In the first two videos, we created a database and then we ran some queries. In this video, we're going to create the front end. So we're going to actually start creating an application in Visual Studio that will be able to display the results of any queries that we do against our database. In the future, we're going to have these topics. After we finish all of that, there'll still be more left unsaid. So there'll be future plans that you can implement. So my name is Shad Sluter, and I teach software development at Grand Canyon University in Phoenix, Arizona. And so I'm glad that you're here. You're going to become a professional software developer if you're able to do these kinds of tasks. So my website is studycoding.org, where you'll find all of the courses that I've taught over the past years. So not only with web development and databases, but with mobile applications and security and other issues. So check it out. And if you like anything there, you can join for a small fee and you get the source code. So let's take a peek at the application as it is in its finished state. So you can see that we have tables that are being searched, and then we're playing some music. So these are all albums that are from the Beatles, and then tracks on each of those albums, and then a player here so we can see a YouTube video. Now what we're going to do in this video is we're going to focus in on this section up here where we're able to display the albums and do searches against them. So in the previous video we set up the database. Now we're going to create the application that does the front end. Alright, so now let's talk about the different ways that people use applications when they are talking to databases. The app that we're going to build here is a very simple app, and that's why I chose this desktop app to do it. It doesn't take much effort to learn how to do this front end. However, if you want to become a professional software developer, you should probably learn how to create web applications. Now, I have tutorials for how to do that in different languages. So C# is a very popular choice for creating web apps. And so the keyword that you're looking for is ASP.NET, and that is the framework that Microsoft uses to connect websites to databases and create a fully functional web page that is an application. An even more popular way to create websites with a common language is Java. So Spring Boot is the keyword that you should be looking for when you're looking for frameworks on how to build websites with Java. And of course, I have a tutorial for how to build a Java web application. Another very popular choice for building websites is using the language PHP. And as a matter of fact, the application that you see in this tutorial is MAMP, which includes PHP as its default language interpreter. And so PHP is also available on studycoding.org if you want to learn how to build websites with that language. Also, you can work with pure JavaScript. If you work with the Express framework on Node.js, you can build a website in the same manner that other websites are built in other frameworks. So there's lots of different choices that you can pick from to build a website. Why are we then not building a website, you might ask? Because this class is focused in on SQL and the databases that go with it. So it's very simple to build the application that we're about to right now. But if you want to be more advanced, if you want to be more employable, then you should probably take some of the other courses that I offer or others do on how to build websites and connect them to databases like MySQL. Anyway, we're trying to build this app. So what we have on the screen is our final product, and we're going to implement just the first part here, and let's get started. So as you can see, I have the database still running in the background here, so I actually don't need that right now, so I'm going to just push that off onto my other desktop. Okay, so let's get started with Visual Studio. You can see that I have two versions installed on my computer. I have 2022 and 2019. So honestly, 2019 works a little bit faster on my old computer, but since we're in 2022, we might as well get with the times and show you this bigger, heavier version that is going to have all the features we need. So here it is. This is the startup screen to say what kind of projects would you like to open or build. So I'm going to select the item that says create a new project, and I'm going to make sure that I select the right places. So the templates up here you can search for, or you can filter them using these choices. So I want to do C#, Windows app, and a desktop. Then I'm going to go down and pick one of these two options. Now, Microsoft is really good at confusing people about which one is which. What is the difference between a Windows Forms app and a Windows Forms app with .NET Framework? Well, in the description, this one says it uses .NET Framework. These two things are different, even though they have very confusing and similar language. So I believe the choice that I made for this one to get the most current is the first item that says Windows Form App. And .NET Framework below is not the choice. That is for an older version. So let's try Next and see what happens. So now I need to create this with some kind of a name. So I'm going to say this is a database SQL music app. And I'm going to leave the other choices the same. You can see the location where I'm putting this is on my desktop. And let's choose Next. Now I know that I've chosen the correct application type because of the next screen. So the framework that pops up next is version 6.0 of .NET. So it says long-term support. So at the time of this video here in 2022, this is the most current version that I can program. If you pick something that's older than this, frankly, it will work just as well probably. But 6.0 is what we've got right now. And if you're from the future, this will probably still continue to work very similar. So I'm not doing anything that is cutting edge with the .NET framework. So I'm picking the current one just because that's a good practice. Okay, let's create it and then give it a minute to build everything. Hooray, everything came out. So we have Form 1 here, and I'm just going to click the green button at the top that says make this application run. I just want to test it out to make sure everything's good, and I should see an app on the screen. So sure enough, here comes Form 1, and I could minimize Visual Studio in the background, so that way I have my beautiful blank app to look at on the beautiful background. Now I'm going to put two things on this screen to get started with, and then we're going to start connecting our application to the database. So the two things that I'm going to put on here are a button and then some kind of a data grid that I can use to display a bunch of pieces of data. So the button we're going to drag in from our common controls area, and I'm going to change the text of the button so that it says load albums. So at least the user knows what that button's supposed to do. Let's make it a little bit wider so it all fits. Then the second item that I'm looking for is in the data controls area. So I search for something called the data grid view. And the data grid view is really why we're building this app in Windows Forms, because it requires no configuration, almost none anyway. So it'll be able to display data from the database. And of course I need to make this wider. I've got kind of a poor user interface design. When we're finished here, we're going to have a whole bunch of stuff on one screen, which is very easy to program, but really if I were teaching this as a user interface class and a user experience, I would have multiple forms. But remember, the focus on this course is on SQL and how to make the database work. So that's why our app is going to look kind of busy on the main form. So I got this thing here with a form, and it has a button and a grid control. Next, I'm going to have an album class. So this is a data class in object-oriented programming that will connect our properties in the class with the column names in our database table. Now I'm recalling all of the things that I put into the database as I create this album class. Each property here is going to represent a string or an integer or something like that, some data type that is in an album. So the first thing that each album has is an ID number. So I type in PROP and then press tab to get the property of an integer. The first thing is called ID. The second property is the album's name. So you could call it album title, you could call it album name. I'm going to purposely not name this the same thing as my database because I want to make sure that we handle certain exceptions or certain cases when there's discrepancies between a class name and a table name. Generally people like to keep them the same, but I'm purposely making them different here just to highlight some things. Then we go on, we're going to have the artist name. So in my case, it's always the Beatles. And then the next one is a year, so an integer value for the year comes up. We're going to make an image URL. So this is the title image of the album. So this is not the URL for the song, the YouTube song yet. This is just an image of what we got out of Wikipedia. And also from Wikipedia, we grabbed the first paragraph, which is the description. So that also matches as a string type. So I've got a bunch of properties here that are corresponding to the table that we made in the previous video. All of these things about an album. Now I know that later I'm going to add some songs to the album, but I want to keep this simple for this video, so I'm just going to leave comments now to say that coming soon is a list of type track, and this list of tracks will be associated with the album. But right now we're just going to put it in comments because we're doing one thing at a time. Okay, so we got ourselves a bunch of properties. Now I'm going to make some data and put it into our form, and we'll connect to the database in a while, but for right now I just want to create some dummy data that will make sure that this grid has something to look at. Now I want to handle all of the database operations in another class, and it will be the kind of the interface between the app and the table. So I'm going to call this thing albums DAO. So DAO is a shortcut for data access object. Its job is to be able to do all the queries, and then it'll provide a layer between these the front end and the back end. So just to make sure that we keep these things kind of simple in each video, I'm going to first of all construct this thing without connecting to the database itself. I'm going to create some dummy data, and then we'll display it in the grid. So we're not going to keep this code here for very long. It's just a test. I'm going to type the word list and an open bracket. And one of the nice features that you get of Visual Studio 2022 is the type ahead help. And it predicted correctly that I wanted to make a list called albums. It's a list of type album. What it did not predict was that I wanted to initialize the list, so it has some list value in it. It's not an empty list. It's not a null list. It's got values. So it's a list of 0 values, but it still is defined. All right, so this is just a placeholder right now. We're just going to create an empty list. Now let's go into Form 1 and let's create some events that will fill this list with some fake data. So I'm going to switch over to Form 1 Design, and I'm going to double click on the Load Albums. And so now we have an event for this button click. So button click 1. Now this is going to be temporary code that we'll delete in a few minutes, but we're just going to test it out. So I'm going to add the albums DAO class and initialize it with a new instance of this class. So when we click the button, it'll create a brand new list from scratch every time we click it. Now, as soon as I have the list created, I'm going to start filling it with some data. So let's create a new album. I'll name this thing as an album of A1. And after we create the new album, let's fill it with some properties. So the first item that we're up to is ID. So ID1 sounds good to me. Let's take the album name to be my first album. And I might as well be the artist, so put my own name in there. The year is 2022. Let's put in an image URL of nothing yet, I guess. I don't know what URL I want for the picture. For the description, let's put in nothing special. So now we have A1. And we might as well make this have 2 albums since it is a list. So I'll copy and paste album 1, and I'll name the second one as A2 and change the first name so it is my second album. Now what I'd like to do is add the first song to my albums DAO. So I'm going to try that, but I'm going to come up with a problem. So it says albums DAO dot albums. Now there's a list of albums in there, but I can't see it for some reason. But it allows me to continue ahead typing and add A1. So why can't I actually add something to albums A1? Let's see. It says in my problem help, it says it's inaccessible due to its protection level. So it means I probably made it private, and I could turn it public so that I could actually do the thing that I'm trying to do now. So let's go back to the albums DAO. And sure enough, let's go here and change this to public, and we'll save it. And now what happens when I come back to my Form 1? So the error goes away. Looks like that was the problem, and we've solved it. Now, very helpful. I go to the next line, and I type in an A, and I get some type ahead help, and it guesses that I want to add the second album to the list. Okay, great. So all of that work was to simply add 2 albums to our list of data. Now I want to associate this list with the control that's on the screen. Now, one of the tricky parts about building an application with C# and Windows Forms is called a binding source. So a binding source is the ability to connect a list of items, such as albums, to the control, so the grid control. And so I'm just going to define this here, and you're going to kind of follow along to see how the format works. So binding source is the class name that is allowed to connect these two. And I'm going to let the type ahead help me to call it a new binding source. Now I'm going to rename the binding source because I'm going to specifically have one for the albums and another one later for the tracks. So I'm going to name this one as the album binding source. So to make that work, or make that binding source work, we're going down to the click button action. And so after I've added a couple of albums, I'm going to create a connection between the list and the grid view. So this is where the binding source comes in. So I'm going to define this thing as the album binding source dot and get a property called data source. And I'm going to set that equal to be the list that I made. So it is the albums DAO, and it's not as smart as I thought. I have to add a dot and tell it that the list is called albums. So putting these two together should allow the grid source to show these two new albums. Now there's one more final step that we have to do. We have to tell the grid view that this binding source is associated with it. So I type in data grid view 1 dot, and it has a property called data source. And so programmatically, we're setting it up to be equal to this list. Okay, so now all of this connection should be done correctly. At least I think it is. Let's try it. I'm going to run the app. So I click the little green triangle at the top, and let's see what happens. So I've got the app. Let's see. I'll minimize the rest of this so it's kind of out of the way. And what does Cortana up to? Get out of the way. Okay, so here we go. Now I'm going to choose Load Albums. And look at there. So the binding source of these two albums now displays all of the squares in like a spreadsheet grid. So that's the magic of this control. It automatically creates the number of columns it needs, and if these get to be too long, it puts in scroll bars. And so this is easier to do than if you're trying to create some kind of a web page. Most of this binding source and data source does the work for you. All right, so that is not exactly what we want. We have a couple of albums. They're nice albums, but they're not the real ones. What I want to do is get all those Beatles albums that are in the database. And so we have still not connected our database to the control, although you can see we are almost there. So in the next video, we're going to do that. We're going to set up a connection between the SQL server and the app that you see here. And then we'll get the data live from the database. So let's take a look at the index of where we've been. So you can see that we're on part 3, which is building a front end. So the front end is got some pieces to it. It's not complete, but at least we can see where we're going. What's next? Next is to connect that app that we just started and connect it to the database. So we're not using fake data anymore. We're getting the actual albums from the Beatles. And so that will be the next task that we do. So we're on part 4 coming up.